Torey's just a kind person, and we're still a family. He's still every bit as much a part of our family as before.
Denial is the heartbeat of delusion. Shannon Adamcik is the mother of Torey Adamcik, one of the two infamous scream killers who, in September of 2006, tormented and then brutally murdered his 16-year-old friend and classmate, Cassie Stoddart. Torey Adamcik and his accomplice, Brian Draper, are currently serving life sentences without parole. Torey's mom, Shannon, wrote a book proclaiming her son Torey's innocence. And while there were many negative reviews, there were plenty positive as well. I disagree with the negative reviews. It seems very plain to me that he thought this was play acting, a prank, and that Brian was not going to actually randomly murder their friend. I cannot put into words how deeply I feel for the family and the injustice that Torey is going through. It's very clear that Torey Adamcik is innocent and is the victim of a corrupt judicial system. Not everyone was so easily convinced. Rip to all the trees used to print this book. Wish there was a 0-star option. Delusional. The mental gymnastics to convince herself of her son's innocence perhaps gives clues how he turned out the way he did. I would compare this book to fan fiction. As of March of 22, Torey's request for post-conviction relief would hit the 9th District Supreme Court and would be denied for the last time. He will serve the rest of his life in prison for the murder he was convicted of when he, like his victim Cassie, was only 16 years old. Torey and his family still maintain his innocence today. According to them, it was Brian Draper who plunged a knife 29 times into Cassie's body, not Torey. Perhaps predictably, Brian's defense also shifted the blame as well, claiming that Torey was the one who murdered Cassie.
I remember the first article I read about my case. Geez, I mean, they made me sound like this brutal, cold, psychopathic killer.
They were talking about Brian. They were making you just like Brian.
They put us like as the same person.
They lumped them together.
Shannon argues in her book, Brian was the more troubled and deranged kid. Brian freely admits he idolized the Columbine shooters.
I got into Columbine.
We saw these two kids. They were white and they
are reported to have gone off. Upwards of a dozen people were injured. They're running out of the
Columbine kind of created a subculture for disenfranchised, kids who don't fit in anywhere. I saw at the time they transcended their high school. For the hour that they did what they did, they were in the spotlight, and that's what I wanted. I wanted to be in the spotlight.
This video is brought to you by Etmix and Oliver, my first 2 Patreon members. You can join too and help me get to 100 patrons so I can launch the private Discord. Now let's get back to the video. According to Shannon's book, Torey thought Brian was all talk. Torey believed Brian was going to pull a prank, scaring Cassie, but not actually stabbing her to death. And Torey didn't know what to do once Brian took things too far. We are going to explore what happened and why Shannon believes her son is innocent. I must warn you, her book contains some absolutely alarming statements. She repeatedly compares the pain of her son's conviction for murder to the loss experienced by Cassie's family, a loss for which her son is responsible. She even goes as far to say that the quick death of Cassie might be preferable to the slow death of Torey, who is now in prison. Brian killed Cassie quickly. He is killing Torey slowly. I'm not sure which is worse. Cassie's mom, Anna, said this: "It's just ridiculous. The parents need to get over their denial, realize that Adamcik did it, and he's going to spend the rest of his life in jail, and he should. They still have their son. I have to visit my daughter in the cemetery. I didn't get to see her graduate or get married or have babies." Shannon recalls a moment during trial when autopsy images of Cassie's body were shown to the jury, causing Cassie's family to step outside, overwhelmed by emotion, as any parent would be when faced with images of their brutally murdered daughter. Yet she accuses Cassie's family of being manipulative in that moment. Soon he was sobbing hysterically and had to be escorted from the courtroom. Someone whispered it was a ploy, a plan to manipulate the jury's emotions. Like all narcissists, Shannon and her son, by proxy, are always the victims in every situation they find themselves in.
I don't know, I just think I look at myself now and I'm 21 and I think how stupid I was at 16, and I just think how I feel like I'm paying for somebody else's mistakes at this point.
Torey's mistake was being associated with Brian, dragging Torey into a false murder conviction. Shannon voices the idea that fate or random events have made her family a victim of this tragedy, rather than a conscious effort by her son. We're going to go over this case and point out how differently Shannon depicts the events in her book, and then I'm going to give you my conclusion on Torey, Brian, and their families. If you're not familiar with this case, it's absolutely wild and almost unbelievable. Brian and Torey were invited to hang out with Cassie and her boyfriend, Matt, on a Friday night while Cassie was house-sitting alone at her aunt's house over the weekend. The four teenagers toured the house, a 4-bedroom split-level home sitting on 2 acres. They played with the weight machine and later began watching a movie upstairs. Before the movie was over, Brian and Torey said they were bored and left to go see a different movie at the theater. But they never left. They changed into dark clothing, masks, gloves, and armed themselves with real knives and re-entered the basement of the house. They got in easily because Brian unlocked the back door when he toured the house earlier that evening. Cassie would never see this coming. She had invited Torey and Brian over a few days prior, and they were considered friends. They even had classes together. After the boys snuck back into the basement, they repeatedly cut the power to the house, hoping to lure Cassie and Matt downstairs to the circuit breaker, where they planned to ambush them. Their plan failed because Cassie and Matt probably didn't even know what a circuit breaker was or how to deal with a power outage, so they decided to try another plan. They broke 2 glass ashtrays on the stairs, creating some commotion to scare Matt and Cassie. However, only the pet dog would come down to the basement door to bark. Matt eventually had to leave, and he told his mom on the phone he was worried for Cassie's safety. He had heard strange noises, and the power was out. He asked if he could stay the night. His mom said no, but she welcomed Cassie to stay with them. Cassie, being an honorable girl, didn't want to abandon her responsibility, that being house-sitting and taking care of her aunt's animals, and so she stayed at the house alone. Brian and Torey heard Matt leave from the basement. They now had Cassie to themselves. They donned their masks, cut the power, and went upstairs and stabbed Cassie 29 times. The initial autopsy could not determine if 2 separate knives were used. In fact, the examiner could not even conclude whether a knife was used at all. The state examiner was only sure that it was a sharp object that killed Cassie, but we know now that this state examiner would later give up their license after multiple botched autopsies. We know that she was stabbed in the back, the chest, in the leg, and she had multiple defensive wounds, including an almost severed finger, where she had likely put her hands and arms up to block the attack. But she didn't stand a chance. In addition to the defensive wounds, there was a cord wrapped around her leg, more evidence that she was resisting and well aware of what was happening as she was stabbed to death. The prosecution hired an expert who could, in fact, identify 2 distinct injury patterns, one caused by a serrated knife and another by a smoother style blade, indicating that there were 2 different knives that inflicted mortal wounds. But there were other challenges for the prosecution. Cassie's blood was only on one of the knives, and only one glove, and only on one of the black shirts that they were wearing, indicating that the actual stabbing might have only been done by one of the boys, the other boy being just a witness to the murder. The murder scene had blood everywhere, as you can imagine, and after they tested for DNA, they discovered that while Brian's clothes and gloves had Cassie's blood, Torey's clothes did not, complicating things further. Samples taken from under Cassie's nails contained only Brian's DNA and not Torey's. The physical evidence certainly was damning for Brian. Additionally, Torey's defense team called into question the validity of the prosecution's autopsy findings. They hired a well-respected medical examiner who worked for the FBI to weigh in. He did not agree with the previous findings and could not differentiate between the different knife wounds. He conducted a test on a pig with knives similar to the ones used in the murder, proving his theory. If he was right, the physical evidence would entirely point to a lone killer, that being Brian, not Torey. However, the prosecution objected to these findings, and the judge sustained their objection. This is because they didn't use the actual knives from evidence in the experiment and testing. There was debate about whether the defense had access to the knives and evidence. The judge said they could have had access had they requested, but they didn't, and it was too late now, and the trial had already started, and it was settled. The judge threw the evidence out and did not allow the defense's expert witness, the FBI credentialed medical examiner, to testify in front of the jury. Shannon blames both her legal team for the mistakes and the prosecution for what she claims was an effort to frame evidence against her son. Initially, the detectives were focused on Cassie's boyfriend, Matt. He was considered at the time the last person who saw Cassie alive. When he was picked up from Cassie's house, Matt's mom stayed in the car and never saw Cassie. When Cassie's aunt came home with her family on Sunday, Cassie's 13-year-old cousin first discovered her lifeless body.
I need an ambulance. Okay, what's going on? There's a girl dead on my floor. She's missing a finger. On my floor, bleeding, not moving.
The 13-year-old knew Cassie was going to be home and was excited to spend time with her older cousin. So she was the first to scramble through the house, eagerly looking to greet her older cousin. The young girl would later attempt to take her own life as she struggled to cope with the trauma. After speaking with Matt, detectives would interview Torey and Brian at their respective houses on Sunday night, a few days after the murder. The boys had established an alibi, but it would not check out. They claimed they went to the movies, but they couldn't recall the plot of the movie they saw, and despite being well known at the theater, nobody saw them there, and the security footage didn't either. Police obtained cell phone records from Torey and discovered that Torey had made phone calls near Cassie's house during the time he said he was at the theater. We would later find out that Matt had called Torey while he was in the basement of the house, putting Torey at the scene of the crime and not at the theater. Matt described what happened. He said that he and Cassie were upstairs in the living room when the power went out. It was pitch dark. He and Cassie went through the upstairs and turned every light switch to the on position so that they would know when the power came back on. When they finished, they returned to the living room and sat on the couch. Eventually, the hall light came back on and the outlet in the kitchen that powered the cordless phone, but nothing else. Matt called Torey on his cell phone and told him the power was off. While Matt was talking to Torey, who was hiding downstairs in the garage, he noticed that Torey was whispering. Matt asked him why. Torey told Matt that he was whispering because he was at the movie theater with Brian. Matt seemed to accept the explanation. He did not question Torey further. Knowing the alibi wasn't going to work, the boys made up a better lie. Torey told detectives they were breaking into vehicles near Cassie's house, and so it's understandable why they would have lied to police initially about their story. Of course, Torey only took a few dollars and change, and Brian would take the bills, and you're right in thinking that detectives didn't believe anything Torey had to say. Even his mom and dad threw wrenches in one of Torey's stories, saying that the CD he claimed to have stolen had been in the house longer than he stated.
But I didn't get anything.
Did Brian get anything?
Brian got a few dollars.
Dollars, like in change?
I don't think he went after change. I think he just went after bills.
Where did he get the bills, you know?
Out of the change.
Okay, so there's kind of money there. Was there no bills in your change thing? Just all change?
I got all change.
Okay.
Torey wants to prove to the detectives he was stealing and not stabbing. He wants proof, so he lies about a CD case that he could show them that he claims to have stolen.
Yeah, they were CDs from the CD case.
Well, we'll
They
think on
came
that.
from that CD case?
Yes,
But not that night or yes that night?
I'm pretty sure it was that night.
Okay.
I
So
can't remember.
you think he came from a van
Yes,
down on that street somewhere there?
Yeah.
White van?
yeah.
Ford?
I don't know.
No, it couldn't have been
Windows?
that night, Torey, because
It
they've been
wasn't.
sitting there stacked up for 2-3 days.
2-3 days.
Yeah.
Well,
those
that was
CDs.
Friday night, though.
No, I mean 2 or 3 days before the weekend.
I can't remember.
Right. We'll take the white CD out of computation.
This is one of the many examples of how dumb Torey's parents were throughout this entire process. Thankfully, Brian had even less foresight. Because while Torey's amateur deception was obvious to anyone, detectives already knew he was involved in the murder. They had something so damning that, as Shannon would later claim, essentially caused the detectives to stop their investigation.
We're going for a high death count.
We're not going not to get caught, Ryan. If we're going for guns, we're just going to end it. We're just going to grab the guns and get out of there and kill everybody and leave.
Torey and Brian had just left Cassie's house. It was the night before the murder, and they had just learned of her plans to be home alone at her aunt's house that weekend.
She's gonna be alone in a big, dark house out in the middle of nowhere. How perfect can you get? I mean, like, holy shit, dude.
I'm horny just thinking about it.
Hell yeah. So we're gonna fucking kill her and her friends, and we're gonna keep moving on. I heard some news about Kirsten. She's gonna be home alone from 6 to 7. So we might kill her, then drive over to Cassie's thing and scare the shit out of them, then kill them one by fucking one.
Not only did they submit voices that could arguably qualify as cruel and unusual punishment under the Geneva Convention, but they also admitted on tape to planning the murder.
For all you FBI agents watching this, you weren't quick enough.
You weren't quick enough and you weren't smart enough. We're skipping our 4th hour. We're writing our plan right now for tonight. It's gonna be cool. We can get our first kill done, started, and we can keep going.
For you future serial killers watching this tape, I don't know what to say.
It's
good luck
fun.
With that. Yeah. Hopefully you don't have to go through 8 or 9 failures like we had.
Yeah. We probably tried maybe 10 times, but they've never been home alone, so.
Or when we have, the parents show up.
As long as we're patient, you know, and we were patient and never getting paid off because our victims home alone. So we got our plan all worked out now.
If there was any doubt the murder was premeditated, Brian and Torey erase it.
I'm sorry. I'm sorry, Cassie's family, but she had evil one. We have to stick with the plan. And she's perfect, so she's gonna die.
There's a lot more on this tape, including what seems like a typical exchange at school, but this was the day of the murder, and we know now the boys had planned to kill Cassie that night.
Say hi, please. Hi. Okay, see ya. Wait, have you seen Torey? He's supposed to meet me here at 7:30, and it's 8:19. He's an hour late. You don't even care, do you? Okay, see ya.
Later that night, Brian turns the camera back on after they claim to have left for the movie theater.
Unfortunately, we have the grueling task of killing our 2 friends. And they are right in that house just down the street.
We just talked to them. We were there for an hour. But
We checked out the whole house. We know there's lots of doors. There's lots of places to hide. I unlocked the back doors, so it's all locked. Now we just gotta wait. And yeah, we're really nervous right now, but you know, we're ready.
we're listening to the greatest rock band
And we've
ever,
waited for this for a long time.
Pink Floyd, before we commit the ultimate crime of murder.
We waited for this for a long time.
A long time.
We'll stay tuned.
And just when you think they couldn't incriminate themselves anymore,
Just killed Cassie. We just left her house. This is not a fucking joke.
I'm shaking.
I stabbed her in the throat and I saw her lifeless body just disappear. Dude, I just killed Cassie. Oh, fuck. That felt like it wasn't even real. I mean, it went by so fast.
Shut the fuck up. We gotta get our act straight.
It's okay. Okay, well, let's buy movie tickets now.
Okay.
Come on, everybody.
No.
Goodbye.
the detectives had everything they needed to arrest Torey before he walked into the police station. The meeting with police was just to get as much information as they could before they made the arrest. Earlier that day, detectives had met with Brian for his second interview. He breaks down emotionally and puts himself and Torey at the scene of the crime, but blames it all on Torey. This truly is one of the worst quality police tapes I've ever seen. The audio's terrible, and the detectives keep standing in front of the camera.
You kept saying that. I get
Even Brian's dad, who is comforting him early on in the interview, completely changes his body language and even averts his gaze away from Brian as he realizes what his son is involved in. The detectives announce their plan. If Brian really is the innocent one, then why don't they call Torey from Brian's house on a recorded line? The police could give Brian a script and they could get Torey to incriminate himself. But Brian knew that wasn't going to work. At one point, they leave Brian in the room alone. He has this emotional breakdown, trying to convince himself that he's not involved.
So sorry. I didn't know. What is the Cassie doing? Who was there with me? Cassie, I would have stopped him, Cassie. I would have stopped him. I would have stopped him, Cassie. I would have stopped him. I'm sorry. I will never see you again. I didn't know you could ask me like that. I'm sorry.
He decides to hatch a plan that would derail the detectives, but at the same time, show that he was behaving in good faith. And out of nowhere, Brian announces he remembers he has a bag with the murder weapons, the clothing they wore, the masks, and other items in the bag he buried at Black Rock with Torey. He was likely hoping that this would show how cooperative he was with the investigation.
I just heard something again. The bag is buried on Black Rock. I didn't tell him that. I don't know. It just came back. No, it's on Black Rock. No. Yeah, I'm positive. Oh, crap. She said that before. I'm sorry.
It's a Black Rock.
Yeah, from Black Rock. Not me. I'm sorry. Okay. Sorry. That's okay.
He was the good guy, coming clean with the real story. Of all the evidence at Black Rock, the most important finding by far was the videotape. Brian wouldn't have led police to that spot if he knew that it was still operational. Brian had attempted to destroy the tape with matches and hydrogen peroxide, but that had done little damage to anything. To make matters worse, Torey was unaware he was being recorded after the murder. And Torey had no idea that detectives had the tape or that it was far more incriminating than he could have imagined. One major point of contention is that Shannon believes Torey was not given proper Miranda warning. And it's statements like this that make me skeptical that she is a trustworthy historian. The prosecution later claimed that Adamcik had read Torey his Miranda rights near the beginning of the interview. Technically, I suppose he did, but I was in the room and I certainly never knew that Torey was being Mirandized. Sean didn't either. Adamcik did not actually say the very familiar words you hear on TV.
And, I want you to know now that, you read your rights so people understand your rights, and so anytime you're interviewed by the police for the most part, and you're coming down to the station or an interview room here, people sometimes get the impression maybe they're in custody and they're not free to leave. So it's a good time to give you your rights so you understand, what your rights are per Miranda. And I'll just go ahead and read them too. If you have any questions, just go ahead and let me know.
The detective explicitly states that he's giving a Miranda warning. The reason he's doing this is because suspects often feel like they can't leave. If Shannon thought that she could leave, they wouldn't need a Miranda warning.
It says, before you ask any questions, you must understand your rights, okay? You have the right to remain silent. However, anything you do say can and will be used.
And for the sake of brevity, the detective goes through the entire Miranda warning step by step.
You understand that anything you say can and will be used against you. Same token, if we ask you something you don't like.
And he even goes out of the way to summarize what a Miranda warning is for Torey at the end.
You're not being forced to ask any questions, okay? And you can just sign it right there. It's just your signature that you understand your rights.
And so we're going to take a minute to talk about Miranda warnings. The Supreme Court ruled that if police are questioning you and you are not free to leave, such as when you are detained or arrested, they must inform you that you do not have to speak with them and that you have the right to an attorney. And so despite what Shannon would lead you to believe, the detectives did just that for Torey. One could even argue that since he was told he was free to leave at that time, the police didn't have to give a Miranda warning, but they did anyway to be safe. What's so ironic about this situation is that Torey's mom documents in great detail the meetings she had with her lawyers right before they brought Torey to the police station for questioning. It was almost 5 p.m. and the lawyer that would have been assigned to the case was out of town. A few partners sat down with the Adamcik family. They made their introductions and they had a short meeting. The lawyers told them not to talk to detectives and that they were ill prepared to do anything that night. And the lawyers refused to go down to the police station with Torey. In Shannon's versions of events, she tells us that while they're at the lawyer's office, Detective Gansky is asking Sean to come down to the police station for a chat. So Sean asks everyone in the room, what do I tell the detective? Shannon says that Greg or Braun said nothing. Those are the partners at the firm. And then she writes, when Sean saw that he was not going to get any help from the attorneys, he finally said, we're finishing up here. And you got to remember, Greg and Braun have only been talking to this family about this case for about a half hour, and Shannon says that Greg and Braun looked grave. Greg leaned in across the table and looked directly at Torey. He said, son, if you had anything to do with this, if you know anything about what happened, do not talk to police. You can get an attorney, even if Aaron, who's the attorney who's out of town right now, does not take this case. They have public defenders you can talk to. Before they leave, Sean asks, well, are you going with us tonight or not? And Greg, the lawyer, said, we are not prepared to go tonight. Shannon doesn't take their advice and goes anyway. At one point, things are getting heated in the interview room. The detectives start to just lay it all out on the line for Torey. His dad decides to discontinue the interview and wants to speak with Torey alone in a separate, non-recorded room.
Okay, we know some things to be true. We know exactly what happened. We found some things, okay? And, I want to give you the first chance and the first opportunity.
You owe it to your mom and dad.
Absolutely.
You've got great parents. You owe it to your mom and dad to be straight with
We are all here for you, bro. If you got drug into some things, which apparently you did, we need to know, and we need to know the truth. Okay? I guess the best way I can explain it is the house of cards is falling. And it's kind of, stories are falling apart and stuff like that.
Torey, you know where we're going with this.
Yeah.
You know what we have.
We've talked to a lot of people. We've seen a lot of things. We've put the pieces of the puzzle together. That's what we do. That's all we've been doing. We've been sleeping. Okay? We know how it went down.
Tell us what happened.
With what?
Out of Cassie's place.
We went through cars, me and Brian.
Okay. I'm not here to insult you or anything, but we don't believe your story. And we don't believe your story. And I don't think your dad believes your story about going through the cars. It's a tough one. And I don't believe it, especially because I know it's not true. Because we got you going into that house when you parked on the street. We got you going back into Cassie's house. If it was a prank, if you guys are just messing around, fine. We just need to know about that prank, that's going on in there. And if it's you just there to scare him and you guys left and something happened else besides that, let's get that thing out of here. You know what I mean? But in everything that happens, there's always people that are watching. And you go around and talk to all these people, and they finally put together this puzzle. You got the trucker out here. You got the common sense clerk. You got the neighbor. You've got all these people, that see it. You got people seeing your car parked, which you cooperate for us, parking in the neighborhood.
Sean, do you guys go back in just to pull a prank? Is that what happens?
No.
You're into that kind of stuff. I mean, for all intents and purposes, and tell me if I'm screwed up on this, but you like horror movies, you like scare movies and stuff like that. That's what I've been told about you. You dig those kind of movies, right? Thriller movies, whatever you want to call them. You dig those kind of things. Did you go in there just to scare them, just to scare the crap out of them, and be done with it? Because You know, there's no other reason, you know?
Mm-hmm.
So tell us about that. Help us understand a little bit about it. Take a deep breath and do it, bud. You know the truth. The truth is easy for you. But we can help you. If we don't get the truth, we can't come together. We can't work this thing out. We can't do it. You're going to be left out in the cold.
Can I talk to an attorney?
You can do that.
Can you talk to me?
Probably, yeah.
Can I have a minute with him to see if there's
Sure,
something
you should. Absolutely.
They discontinued the interview. We'd all love to hear what Torey and Sean's conversation was about, but we'll never really know what they said. Shannon believes that anything said after this point shouldn't be allowed in court. And she's somewhat right. Once a person in custody says they do not want to answer questions and they want a lawyer, the police cannot just continue to question the suspect. And if they do, it can't be accepted as evidence unless the suspect makes a voluntary, spontaneous statement, which is what occurs here. So pay attention to how this next scene plays out.
We do know that that Torey and Brian have gone back in the house, okay? We do know that the two of them murder. We do know that they murder Cassie, okay? We got the evidence at this point to prove that.
We found the evidence?
We also have some overwhelming evidence, trace evidence, that type of stuff that's going to prove that they did it as well. It's not just hearsay. It's not just somebody saying it. And then we do have a confession from another person giving full disclosure.
So is that why you want to talk to a lawyer?
And here's the deal. With you. What I would like to do is maybe when your wife comes back, sit down and talk to you all, get you up to speed. You know what you need to do. You know exactly what happened, and you know what you need to do. So, unfortunately, you're not going anywhere tonight. You're going to be placed into custody tonight. Okay? I'm sorry that's the way it goes.
You're going to be charged with first-degree murder. Okay?
But like I said before you say anything, I encourage you. If you want to talk to an attorney, you should do that. I'm not pulling punches here. Still. Okay?
Even though you need a lawyer or whatever, you want to talk to a lawyer, I understand that's the advice they gave you today. And then whatever you and the lawyer work out, they want
we
you
know
to
the
cooperate.
details. We've got the knife that you used. We've got the masks that you used. We've got the videotape. We've got it. There's a tape up in there that you buried. Okay? Try to catch on fire. All that stuff. You know what I'm talking about. I don't need to tell you that.
This is right, Torey. What they're saying is true.
So.
The detective informs them that Torey is being charged with murder. In Sean's brilliance, he turns to Torey in a recorded room with detectives and asks Torey a question. And Torey nods in the affirmative. You can't make this up.
You know what I'm talking about. I don't need to tell you that.
This is right, Torey. What they're saying is true.
So.
Shannon still blames the lawyers for their mistake. I would like to know why. Why couldn't they have gone with us? A couple of years have passed. We've been through the trial together, the pretrial motions, and Aaron's bitter fight to suppress the taped interview that would have never taken place if they would have just gone to the police station with us that night. And I want to know why. So far, I've never received an answer to that question. No, Shannon, the tape would have never occurred had you taken the advice of your lawyers. We know now that Torey would have indeed been arrested that night regardless. But he didn't have to essentially agree that the charges were true. He could have been arrested and kept his mouth shut, but he didn't. And for that, I'm thankful. Shannon also claims the lawyers were greedy, despite the fact that Shannon's lawyers gave her some of the best advice she could have possibly gotten. She still blames them. So in other words, she wants them to defend her son, of course a murderer, out of the goodness of their hearts. Okay.
I only hung out with him for 6 weeks before this happened. I think it's crazy how the last week of me being on the street, being free, really has affected the rest of my life. If you were to watch that video and nothing had happened, it would literally be a joke.
Yes, it is crazy how you planned a murder with Brian. And we know now that it literally wasn't a joke. There are just too many quotes from her book that convey Shannon's main character syndrome. Perhaps I'll make a video for Patreon with all of the different passages. It's pretty interesting. And this video could be 3 hours long if we included them all. But for now, we'll just sprinkle in some of the highlights as we move along. The next big quibble that Shannon has with the case is she doesn't think the videotapes are as big of a slam dunk as they seem to be. Yes, the boys clearly planned the murder together, but she says it was fantasy. Torey didn't believe it was real. Only Brian did, of course. One of her most convincing arguments that Torey wasn't involved in the murder is that Brian says, "I killed Cassie" in the videotape. Shannon says that he could have easily said, "We killed Cassie," or "You killed Cassie," but Brian says that he is the one who killed her. And while this is true, Torey also uses inclusive language when he tells Brian, "We need to get our story straight." And let me just point out, in a very calm manner, that's pretty disturbing.
Oh, fuck. That felt like it wasn't even real. I mean, it went by so fast.
Shut the fuck up. We gotta get our act straight.
It's okay. Okay.
And he also uses inclusive language in the planning stages when he says, "We will commit murder."
Before we commit the ultimate crime of murder.
Shannon, you can't have your cake and eat it too. The boys were charged with 2 crimes, conspiracy to commit murder, and of course the murder itself. You could argue that without the murder, the conspiracy to commit murder would be hard to prove. As Shannon points out, these kids could just be fantasizing about Columbine and horror films, but the murder happened. Hindsight tells us that this was not a pretend movie plot, that they were doing exactly what they said they were doing in the videotape they made. During the initial police interview with Torey, Shannon would have to leave early to pick up her other son at a practice.
Do you guys need some help with something?
No. She just needs to leave
Okay.
to go pick up, and then she needs to wait to get back.
Okay, all right. Okay.
Thanks.
This is why it's just Sean and Torey in the interview room at the end. By the time Shannon would get home to drop off her other son before returning back to the police station, her house was in the process of being raided by the police. And there are just so many moments where Shannon's interactions are just so out of place. Watch as she interrupts Torey and laughs during questioning.
Did they have a couple bucks?
Yeah.
What?
Nothing.
It's just so odd. The prosecution was able to find the older teen who helped the boys buy the knives at the pawn shop prior to the murder, and the boys admitted to attempting to commit murder over 10 times on videotape. But the conditions were never perfect. This is why they're so excited when they learn of Cassie's plans to be alone that night. And what's even more scary is how they had a list of targets. It's hard to say who else would have died had they not been caught so quickly. Brian knew he was completely screwed. And while he maintained that Torey was the lone killer throughout his trial, he was convicted months before Torey's trial even began. When Brian was pressed in his 3rd police interview, he admits to stabbing Cassie.
I don't think you're stabbing her to kill her. I don't think you would ever in a million years, Brian, do that. Okay? But you get caught up in the moment and you're just doing it to show them so you don't get turned on. Does that happen? Be honest with us, okay? Is that what happened? Did you just barely get it? Just to try to get the hell out of there? Is that what happens? Yes. Okay. How many times do you think? I mean, was it just a couple once? Okay. You didn't want to? We know that. We know you didn't want to. I don't know. 4 times. Okay. Was it just in the stomach area or the chest? Your leg. Okay. Your leg. Okay. Where else? Well, then you can kick times in the chest with the leg.
And this is just my opinion, of course. I think that this statement has a sliver of truth to it. I do believe that one boy was more gung-ho about killing than the other, but they fed off each other in a sick, competitive way, which was apparent in their videos. And so I think it makes sense that one of the boys might have pressured the other. But what I don't understand all these years later, after the conviction, why wouldn't Brian set everyone straight if it was, in fact, only him? Brian has since admitted to his parents and the world that he was responsible. Here's Brian weighing in on Torey's lack of remorse.
He wants to please his parents. He wants to go home. And his kind of behavior it's really common and it's ordinary, I think. I think what makes somebody extraordinary is when they face everything and just kind of accept it. It's a hard thing to admit, you know. I killed Cassie Stoddart. I stabbed a 16-year-old girl to death. That's pretty hard to say.
He says in an interview that after a few years, he came clean to his parents and told them to stop professing his innocence. Various experts have weighed in on these interviews. Many think he isn't necessarily remorseful, but he knows that acting remorseful is the only self-preserving thing he can do now. He possibly could have a chance at a successful appeal to his life sentence based on the fact that he was a minor at the time of the murder, and he must see how bad Torey looks professing his innocence.
I made some mistakes and I learned from them.
But your mistakes weren't anything that you were charged with. They weren't the murder and the conspiracy.
Yeah.
That was Brian. It must be harder because you're innocent to be facing it.
Yeah, I guess.
In some ways, it humanizes Brian more if he wasn't the lone killer. However, I question like how the boys would ever sit down and talk to each other, which was reported by both of them, if one of them were completely innocent in a life sentence. They even shared a car ride to prison after their conviction and made small talk. The officer driving them said it was like a class reunion and that they didn't have any animosity towards each other. But before we get into analyzing this any further, I just want to take a moment to explain why this section of the video is so important. Torey and Brian didn't make a poor choice and hit someone driving drunk. They murdered somebody who, in their own words, was perfect in a brutal way, literally drawing inspiration from horror films, because they wanted to go down in history as being evil. They lack empathy for other human beings, and to this day, Torey cannot see his part in any of this. In a recent interview, Brian refers to the fact that he hates that someone had to die for him to learn his lesson. It's the same sort of language that Jeffrey Dahmer used when he talked about his killing spree.
I've lived, I've learned, I've loved, you know, and I've made it through it. And I wish so badly that it didn't have to take, you know, a person dying for me to actually understand that, oh my God, like, what am I doing here? But I had to learn the hardest way possible, and I lost everything.
Brian states that a person died instead of acknowledging that he murdered her, and frames it as him losing everything, when in reality, it was Cassie and her family who lost everything. In the same way that Jeffrey Dahmer's victims drank the sleeping mixture rather than being drugged by Dahmer, and then they were strangled rather than being strangled by him.
A person would drink it, fall asleep, and that's when they would be strangled.
I'm not convinced Brian's truly learned anything. We all want to believe our children are good, and I don't think Shannon thought Torey was a murderer when she brought him down to the police station initially, but she clearly got it wrong. What's so strange to me is why anyone looks at people like Sue Klebold, the mother of the Columbine shooter, for advice or insight. And similarly, Brian and Torey's parents, they have nothing to teach us. They're like a weatherman who missed the storm, caught completely off guard by the very disaster they claim to understand. But this video isn't for them. It's time that we as a society examine the environment that evil is created in. The parents of the Oxford school shooter have both been convicted for their role in the shooting their son committed. And look, I'm not saying that every parent of a murderer should go to jail, but they certainly shouldn't be writing books and doing TED Talks to clear their name and tell all of us how normal they were and how the unbelievable evil their children committed could not have been stopped by anything other than random chance, as Shannon would have you believe. So I will continue to look into their claims, and when I can, illuminate how what they say has no relation to what happened in reality. Brian's family talked about how they were kept up at night trying to figure out what they had missed. They paint a picture of a strong relationship.
That's the thing that kept us up at night the most for the longest amount of time, is trying to find trying to remember something that we missed. We adopted Brian at birth. When I think about our relationship and how strong of a relationship we had with Brian and how good of a relationship we had with Brian, if you walked into our house back then, we were normal.
Unlike Torey's parents, Brian's parents can acknowledge the evil in their son's actions and recognize their own role, however small, in shaping who he became.
And why we didn't recognize that we had such a problem is horrific and something we still cannot bear.
Brian had a stutter. It's something you've probably noticed gets worse when he is nervous or anxious. Many people comment on how the stutter was less of an issue in the tapes than how he speaks in police interviews. I also have a stutter, one of the many reasons I don't like doing live content. I've gotten really good at getting around it over the years, and so has Brian in his recent interviews. But I was pretty nonverbal in early childhood, and it's something I've struggled with my whole life. I only bring this up because, in my opinion, many people are wrong in thinking that Brian used a stutter to manipulate people. In my experience, I have to exert a lot of effort to avoid getting stuck on words. Everything from lack of sleep or stress will exacerbate the stutter. Brian was also adopted, and I couldn't find a reason why, but judging by the health of his mom, it was probably a fertility issue and not some sort of altruistic reason. Brian mentions his dad was an alcoholic.
My dad is an alcoholic. He's a recovering alcoholic, but I think I had a large part to play in that.
We don't get too many details here. Brian mentions never seeing him much at all.
But I had a really good childhood. I mean, I had good parents. My dad was always gone, though. I was a kid, and so I didn't really have a good father figure growing up. It's not that my dad wasn't a good dad. He was a great dad, and I love him, but he was always gone. And so I was largely raised by just my mother, and she was busy all the time and stretched thin, so I was largely like a latchkey kid, I believe is what they call it. Kind of came home, I was alone, I kind of ate alone, and so that's kind of how my life was growing up. But we moved to Pocatello when I was like 12 or 13, and I think the transition into junior high school and high school is where things started to kind of fall apart and really exposed all of the gaps I had in my development and all my vulnerabilities. I think that's what really did it is when you're a kid, you're unlike elementary school, everything is very easy and simple, and as you get older, things get a lot more complicated as your social network gets more complicated, and it really tore me apart, and it kind of exposed all my difficulties and my vulnerabilities as I got older.
He also mentions his mom and uses the classic "did the best she could," which are always excuses for her bad parenting.
She was busy all the time, she was stressed out, and so I don't want to speak ill of my mother because I love my mother with all my heart, and she did the best she could. But there's lots of things that I could have learned and things that she could have done differently.
Brian remembers asking his mom for therapy.
Hello. This call is subject to monitoring and recording.
I just wish you would have talked to me about this before, because if you had told me anything.
I told you that I wanted counseling again.
Tell me what, honey?
I told you that I wanted counseling.
You did?
Yeah. Don't you remember that?
No.
Yeah.
Brian's parents would later get divorced, which might be pretty average for American families, but certainly not normal in the way that Brian's dad would have you believe. And according to Brian, his sister would struggle with addiction. And while every family has their problems, do not let anyone gaslight you into thinking Brian, Torey, and the Columbine shooters were just normal people. Brian, like Dylan and Eric, had been reported for planning school shootings. His middle school friend who planned it with him, Chris Nix, was expelled. One student was so worried about Brian, she got Brian to admit his plans to shoot up the school on a phone call. She recorded it on an answering machine and brought it to the school. Brian was reported as running around at school events, picking off students using his hand to represent an imaginary gun. Many students reported that Brian would always talk about how easy it would be to commit a perfect crime. Of course, like all school shooters, nobody takes any of these warning signs seriously enough. Brian had a website where he published a disturbing story called Black River. It was found by detectives on his computer, but was never released to the public. He'd initially written the story in 8th grade, but he updated it over time. Shannon, who probably had access to the evidence in trial, which probably included this Black River story, but I don't really know how she had access to this information or how she knew so many of the details. She describes it as a story about killing classmates with vivid and gruesome descriptions of the sights, sounds, and smells involved. It even includes a body count, specific types of injuries inflicted, and it concludes with an obituary and memorial testimonies. One character in the story, Danielle Morrison, was an actual girl that Brian admired, but never had the guts to talk to. I had my eye on a couple of girls, he wrote, but they didn't even know I existed. The first one's name is Danielle Morrison. She is one of the most beautiful girls that I have ever seen, and I wanted her. I wanted her to be a part of my life, and I was willing to give up anything for her. She is in my first hour and sits across the room from me. All hour when she isn't looking, I just stare at her. I stare into her short blonde hair and her beautiful face. I almost have arousal just thinking about her, but in 3 months, I have yet to speak a word to her. Hers is the only life he spares in Black River. It's always so convenient that the parents say everything is normal, but it wasn't. And I'm very confident that if we had more interviews with them, more information, or if we could peer into their lives, we'd have more to go off of. The Draper family claims that everything came out of nowhere. It's a complete lie, but fortunately, they've done what any wise parent of an evil child does. They've mostly kept their mouth shut. In an interview from 2013, 7 years after the murder, Brian would show some emotion. He would take accountability. In another recent phone interview, Brian speaks with the girl from the It Is What It Is show.
Me and Brian Draper have become friends. And I know a lot of you are going to be like, oh my God, but he's a killer and he killed someone. And I'm aware of that. I'm obviously very aware of that. But I don't believe in judging a person on one thing.
It's really strange. I don't necessarily recommend listening to the full interview, but she minimizes his crime as a one-time thing done many years ago. Yes, because they were investigated immediately and didn't have a chance to do anything else. It's like, it's so frustrating listening to this stuff. Anyway, in this interview, her goal is for us to get to know Brian better. He talks about his life, being a facilitator for music at the prison and reading books and not watching much TV and whatnot. And he mentions that he did see the Lost for Life documentary years ago. Brian puts forth this idea that he wasn't who he was. That was one of his big problems when he was 16. The murderous version of himself wasn't him. If he was only himself, he wouldn't be in the situation he was in. How convenient.
Be okay with who you are. When I was a kid, I was so obsessed with trying to impress others and be somebody else that I never appreciated who I was as a person. And so I was always interested in being somebody else. And so I left Brian Draper behind. And obviously that led me to this, this reality that I'm living now.
He's learned to appreciate life and learn more about the world. When you lose everything, you lose everything.
Ultimately, the lesson I think I learned is that just to appreciate being alive and appreciate being a person, because when you lose everything, and all you want is to get it back.
So that's basically who he is now. He wants a normal life, and he's actually doing what you should do to move closer to that. He doesn't have any actual lessons related to his case, parenting, environment, psychopathy, etc. He thinks he can honor Cassie's life by doing something normal with his life now.
I just had an emotional visit yesterday. I mean, it was really hard to come here alone. It's always hard to go to a prison. And it's hard to walk down the gates and to be buzzed in and to wait and to go through the searches. And then just to imagine doing this forever until I'm dead. Everybody involved is dead except for Torey and Brian, they will outlive, the prosecutors and the families and everybody, and it'll still be going on. It's just very overwhelming all the time that there's never an end in sight, or it's hard to imagine how we're going to spend our life doing this, and I'm just overwhelmed today and a little bit. It's just hard.
As for Shannon, I believe she'd earn more sympathy if she stopped insisting on her son's innocence. By clinging to this belief, she's holding him back from facing the harm he's caused and from any potential growth as a human being.
I was really scared of you coming clean. Years after this happened, we were visiting, and I was like, no, I am not innocent, Mom. I had a part in this. I knew it was going to happen, and I went along with it. And she was devastated, of course. I mean, she had to accept that her son had a part in this horrible crime.
In early childhood, I have seen multiple channels report that Torey was into hurting animals, burying birds and kittens up to their necks and killing them. He also removed the eye of a kitten. I don't have concrete evidence of these claims. There's no police reports or any testimony that I can find, but I thought I'd mention it. And we don't have the notebook that was in Torey's possession. You can see it in the tapes. It was never released to the public, but it contains some disturbing plans, such as a hit list, similar to the Columbine notebook with names of other classmates. Shannon talks about the notebook in her book. A detective was sitting on the edge of Torey's bed, carefully going through Torey's notebooks one page at a time. I went back to the kitchen. A few moments later, the detectives came out. One of them said, "We're taking these notebooks." "What?" I asked, horrified. I could not believe it. Taking the notebooks was like taking a piece of Torey. It was personal. "Please don't do that," I begged. I tried to explain, but they just handed me a receipt as if that was all they needed to do and left me crying. I kept thinking, why hadn't Braun, their lawyer, kept these? I gave them to him. They were right in his hands, and he did not even look at them, but the police did. The police searched them thoroughly. They found a list on a page inside one of the notebooks entitled Ideas for the Movie that they had the word supplies written across the top of it. It was the list of props for the movie that Torey and Brian had been planning, but the prosecution submitted it as evidence of a murder conspiracy along with similar lists found in another notebook. Isn't it insane? The notebook Torey had, detailing the plans to murder Cassie, which actually happened, are still being depicted as a fantasy novel according to his mother. And then there's Torey's appearance in the Lost for Life documentary. It's almost as if Torey looks at his parents like, how dumb are you? It's like he can't believe they are still siding with him and believing his story. Another disturbing fact about Torey, which is seldom mentioned, is that detectives found child pictures and other violent images on his computer. The images depicted male on male, and for a town that is roughly 50% Mormon, this would have been devastating for Torey if it were brought up in front of a jury. The prosecution threatened to use this if the defense tried to bring up a bunch of people as character witnesses to normalize Torey, and their plan worked. Torey's defense team decided to not use character witnesses. There's this cringe segment in the videotape where they're showing off their locker, their trench coat, and movie posters. In case you're wondering if the boys acted out of being bullied, the evidence actually indicates that they were the bullies.
Smokes here. Look at those little legs.
What a fat. Let's go.
As for the physical evidence, I found it really bizarre that they didn't find anything in Torey's car. Both Brian and Torey admitted that all of the clothes, the weapons, the masks, and whatnot were transported in the car to where they buried it at Black Rock. But Shannon tells us that Torey cleaned out his car on Sunday. She says this wasn't unusual for Torey. He was very clean, and they kept everything tidy in their house at all times. She says that detectives asked if they had just moved in, noting how clean the house was. So with that being said, there was a lack of DNA or physical evidence in the car, but that's not evidence that nothing was transported by car. And I actually don't think it's all that strange. Perhaps the detectives had taken more samples, both in the car or his clothing. They could have found more of Cassie's blood or the evidence they needed. Perhaps they did halt their investigation and got a bit sloppy once they had the tape and, of course, Torey's confession. But in my opinion, they didn't need the physical evidence. This case most likely could have been solved without the murder weapons or clothing. The destruction these two caused is hard to measure. Since their sentencing, the Supreme Court ruled that life sentences without parole for minors could not be mandatory, even in the case of murder. I have seen numerous videos and sources cite this decision as grounds to reverse all life sentences given to minors. But the ruling doesn't say that a minor can't be sentenced for life without parole. It just can't be mandatory. It's left up to the judge's discretion in certain cases. And I think Brian and Torey are the exception. They were exceptionally callous and disturbed, and time has only proven that they deserved their punishment. Torey especially remains a twisted, hollow shell of what a human should be, devoid of remorse, consumed by darkness. Brian said it best.
This is my punishment, and this is my reality, and I have to just accept it. And if I don't accept it, I'll always be upset and I'll always be bitter, and it's my fault that I'm here, and I can't blame anybody else, and I have to accept it. Even now, even all these years later, people suffer, from what I did, and so I have to just accept it, and I have accepted it.
And on one hand, it's good that Brian has finally accepted what he did and the situation he is in. But Brian and Torey fought the truth at every step of the way. They denied being involved in the murder, pled not guilty, and took every chance they could to appeal to a lesser sentence. And so they are exactly where they should be. And I know what many of you are thinking about these boys. You'd have to be a psychopath to be capable of something like this, which, funny enough, are Shannon's exact words from her book. How could he have done something like that and not told us? He would have to be a psychopath to be capable of something like that. In an interview, Brian claims that while in prison, he had a 30-minute chat with Torey recently. Brian claims that Torey admitted his guilt to both him and his mom, Shannon.
I did actually talk to him for about probably 30 minutes, and he said, well, what would you do? Like, your son's in prison and he has life in prison, like, what would you do? And what I asked him is have you confessed? And he said this to me on that day, that he told his mom that he took part in the crime as well, and that he's guilty as well. That's what I can tell you.
Now, Brian could be lying, and perhaps Torey was lying as well, but this could explain why Torey and Shannon haven't taken any interviews in a long time. Her websites are no longer active. I attempted to contact her and have received nothing in response. The Lost for Life documentary was released in 2013, most likely filmed in the years prior. Shannon's book was released in 2012, and we have not seen her or Torey make any public statements outside of the 5 appeals from 2010 and now the last and final Supreme Court ruling in 2022. With Shannon's fight seemingly over, will Torey finally be able to confront and process what he did? Is he even capable of that? Many believe Brian appears more disturbed than Torey, both in the tapes and based on his past. And while there may be truth to that, Torey's calm and methodical demeanor during his interrogation stands in stark contrast to Brian's visible emotion, especially when you look at them later in prison when they discuss Cassie. This contrast raises questions not only about Torey's state of mind, but also about the people around him who may be enabling him. Perhaps Torey did admit his guilt to her. Would she have the honor to tell everyone that she was wrong? That she did make mistakes and her son is in fact a murderer? I doubt it.
He's still on his first day. He hasn't progressed at all. And in the end, it's going to hurt him in the end. Either psychologically, if he has a conscience, or in courts. They don't want to hear that you're completely innocent. He's not innocent. He's not. I'm not innocent. I'm guilty, and he's guilty. And that's where we all should start at.